There are people living in Europe right now whose DNA doesn't match anyone else on the continent. Not distantly, not slightly. Genuinely, measurably, stubbornly different, and nobody can fully explain why. We're talking about the Basques, a small group of people tucked between Spain and France in a corner of the Pyrenees where green mountains drop into the Bay of Biscay. About 3 million of them. They speak a language that is related to no other language on Earth. And genetically, they are an outlier so extreme that for decades, scientists weren't sure what to do with them. Here's what makes this so strange. Europe is actually a pretty well understood genetic story. You had the original hunter-gatherers who arrived after the last ice age. Then, about 9,000 years ago, farmers from Anatolia swept in and largely replaced them. Then, roughly 5,000 years ago, herders from the Eurasian steppe, the Yamnaya people, came in and again transformed the genetic landscape of the continent. 3 waves, each one diluting or absorbing what came before. That's the basic framework for almost every European population you can name. Except the Basques break it. They didn't get the memo about the steppe migration. Their DNA shows almost none of the genetic signature that defines most modern Europeans, that Yamnaya ancestry that brought things like Proto-Indo-European languages, new burial customs, and a huge chunk of the continental gene pool. The Basques are sitting there in their mountains, genetically much closer to Neolithic European farmers than to the people who spread across the rest of the continent thousands of years later. It's as if someone pressed pause on their genetic evolution while everyone else kept moving. And the language makes this even weirder. Basque, they call it Euskara, has no known relatives. Linguists call it a language isolate. That means it didn't come from Proto-Indo-European, the ancestral language family that gave us everything from English to Hindi to Russian to Greek. It predates the Indo-European expansion. It is, as far as we can tell, a survivor, a living fossil of speech. When Indo-European speakers flooded Europe, carrying their languages and their culture, the Basques absorbed some of the material culture but apparently held onto their tongue. That almost never happens. Languages usually go extinct or get absorbed. The Basques kept theirs for thousands of years. That's not stubbornness. That's something more fundamental. So who exactly are they descended from? That's where it gets fascinating. The current best answer from ancient DNA research is that the Basques are heavily descended from the Neolithic farmers who colonized Western Europe from Anatolia. These were the people who built megalithic monuments, the long barrows, the standing stones, the early dolmens. They were farmers who crossed into Europe and spread along the Atlantic coast. By the time the steppe herders arrived from the east, these Atlantic coastal populations had been established for millennia. Most of Europe got genetically overwhelmed. But the Basques, in their mountain valleys, absorbed less of that incoming tide. They stayed closer to their Neolithic roots. But here's the thing, it's not just about the steppe migration. Before those farmers even arrived, Europe had its own people, the Western hunter-gatherers. These were the original post-Ice Age Europeans, the ones who painted caves at Altamira and Lascaux, who hunted mammoth and reindeer across the tundra. And the Basques also carry more Western hunter-gatherer ancestry than most other modern Europeans, so they're not purely descended from the Neolithic farmers. They're a blend, but a very specific, archaic blend. A mixture of those original hunter-gatherers and the early Neolithic farmers, with very little of the later steppe input that defines everyone else. Think about what that actually means. When you meet a Basque person, you are meeting someone whose genetic heritage stretches back to before the Bronze Age transition in a way that almost no other living European can claim. That's not metaphorical. The ancient DNA evidence makes this concrete. Studies published in the last decade compared modern Basques to ancient European samples going back thousands of years. And the match is striking. They cluster with ancient populations from before the Big Steppe migration. Genetically, they are closer to Neolithic Europeans than modern Spaniards or French people are, even though modern Spaniards and French people live right next door to them. Now, you might wonder, how is this possible? How does a population sit in the middle of a continent and remain so genetically distinct while everyone around them changes? Geography is part of the answer. The Pyrenees are not a casual barrier, they're a wall. The valleys where Basques have historically lived are isolated, steep, difficult to access. During periods of upheaval, migrations, invasions, plagues, these mountain refuges would have attracted people who wanted to be left alone, and simultaneously been less attractive to outsiders looking for conquest or settlement. Isolation breeds genetic uniqueness. When a small population stays relatively closed for long enough, its gene frequencies drift away from surrounding populations. Over thousands of years, that drift adds up. But geography alone can't explain everything, because the Basques haven't been perfectly isolated. They traded. They sailed. In fact, Basque whalers and fishermen were some of the greatest maritime explorers of the pre-Columbian era, reaching North America well before Columbus, following cod to the Grand Banks. They were colonized by Rome, they lived under Visigothic kingdoms, they were incorporated into Spanish and French states, they weren't in a sealed bubble, and yet their genetics remained stubbornly distinct. That suggests something else is at work: cultural resistance, a ferocious attachment to identity. The language was part of this. If you maintain a completely different language, you create a social barrier that slows genetic mixing. Marriage within the community becomes the norm. Outsiders who want to integrate face a high cultural cost. Over generations, this cultural wall reinforces the genetic one. There's also the blood type angle, which is one of the most famous pieces of the Basque genetic puzzle. The Basques have the highest frequency of Rh-negative blood in the world, specifically the O-negative type. About 30% of Basques are Rh-negative, compared to about 15% of Western Europeans generally, and much lower proportions in populations from Africa or Asia. For a long time, this was treated as a mystery in itself, and it gave rise to some truly wild theories: ancient aliens, lost civilizations, you name it. The reality is more mundane, but still interesting. Rh-negative blood is not magical or extraterrestrial. It's a variant of the Rhd gene. The high frequency in Basques is almost certainly a founder effect, meaning that the ancestral population from which Basques descended happened to carry a high proportion of this variant, and because the population stayed relatively closed, that frequency was maintained and even amplified over time. It's a genetic signature of isolation and ancestry, not of alien intervention. But it is real, and it is striking. Let's talk about what ancient DNA studies have actually found, because this is where the science gets specific and the picture sharpens dramatically. In 2015, a landmark study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences analyzed ancient remains from a cave in northern Spain, the site of El Portalón in the Atapuerca complex. They found Neolithic and Chalcolithic skeletons from around 5,500 years ago. When they compared the DNA from those ancient individuals to modern populations, the closest match was the Basques. Not Spaniards, not French, not any other modern European group, the Basques. This was direct genetic continuity across thousands of years. The people living in those mountains today are genetically closer to the people buried in those caves than anyone else alive. Then in 2019, a massive study led by researchers at Harvard and using ancient DNA from across Iberia pushed the picture further. They showed that the Basques represent a population that absorbed less of the Bronze Age steppe migration that transformed the rest of Iberia. While populations across Spain and Portugal show a large steppe genetic component arriving roughly 4,500 years ago, associated with people who probably spoke early Indo-European languages and who brought a whole new cultural package with them. The Basques show much less of this. They got some. They're not perfectly isolated, but compared to their neighbors, they are dramatically different. And crucially, they kept their pre-Indo-European language through this whole period, suggesting that whatever cultural contact happened, it didn't break their linguistic and social core. This raises one of the most interesting questions in all of European prehistory. Was the language always there, or did the Basques specifically resist the Indo-European takeover? You could imagine two scenarios. In one, the Basques were just geographically remote enough that the steppe expansion didn't reach them with enough force to replace their language. In the other, there was active cultural resistance, a people who absorbed some new genetics but deliberately maintained their identity, their vocabulary, their grammar, their songs, in the face of a continental transformation. The truth is probably some of both. But either way, the result is extraordinary. A language spoken today that is a direct descendant of something spoken in Europe before the Bronze Age, before writing, before the wheel was widespread. A voice from a world that otherwise left no words behind. And here's the thing about that language. Euskara is genuinely, structurally alien to anyone trained in Indo-European languages. The word order is different. The verb system is extraordinarily complex, encoding not just tense, but the grammatical person of both subject and object, sometimes simultaneously. The vocabulary has almost no cognates with Spanish or French or any other neighboring language. Learning Basque as an adult is famously, legendarily difficult, but native speakers learn it as children without any difficulty, the way all children learn their mother tongue because the complexity is just the structure of the world to them. Linguists have spent generations trying to connect Euskara to other languages. Some have proposed links to Caucasian languages, to ancient Iberian, to Pictish. None of these hypotheses has held up to rigorous analysis. It stands alone, which means the knowledge system, the way of categorizing reality, the conceptual structure embedded in that language, is a direct inheritance from a pre-Indo-European world that is otherwise completely lost to us. What does all of this mean, taken together? It means the Basques are not just an interesting ethnic group with unusual statistics. They are a window into a world that no longer exists anywhere else. They carry in their DNA the memory of ancient hunter-gatherers and the first farmers of Atlantic Europe. They speak in a language that predates the linguistic transformation of the entire continent. They live in a landscape that sheltered them when everything else was changing. And they survived not as a curiosity, not as a museum exhibit, but as a living, contemporary culture with football clubs and restaurants and politics and music festivals, and also with some of the deepest genetic roots in Europe. There's something almost vertiginous about it when you really sit with the timescales. The steppe migration that the Basques mostly missed happened approximately 4,500 years ago. That's 90 generations. If you drew a family tree going back that far, your ancestors list would include millions of people. And yet here is a population that maintained enough genetic and cultural continuity across those 90 generations that their DNA today echoes the DNA of people buried in Spanish caves before the Bronze Age. That is an astonishing fact about human persistence. And maybe that's the real lesson hidden inside all the genetics and linguistics. We tend to think of history as a story of change, migrations, conquests, transformations, and it is. But the Basques remind us that resistance is also a form of history. Staying put, keeping your language, marrying within your community, speaking the same words your ancestors spoke when the pyramids were being built, when Rome was still a swamp, when all of Europe was reshaping itself around a new kind of people. The Basques didn't resist change because they were afraid. They resisted because they had something worth keeping. If this kind of deep history, genetics, ancient peoples, languages from before civilization as we know it, if that's the kind of thing that makes you feel alive, hit subscribe. There's a lot more where this came from, because the past is not over. It's right there in the blood.